Dear ladies and gentlemen, friends of the American-Hellenic Chamber of Commerce, on behalf of our chamber, I welcome you to our today's exclusive virtual session on the first 100 days of the Biden-Harris administration. From what we see up to now, the new U.S. administration is determined to proceed with full speed with implementation of a rich agenda that includes confronting the coronavirus pandemic with a rapid vaccination program, stimulating the economic recovery with a very ambitious economic program, overhauling the climate policy, and finally reshape its foreign policy. Especially the latter, we observe a dynamic reapproach of the traditional friends and allies, especially on the transatlantic relations. Speaking about transatlantic relations, the EU is the largest exporter to the United States and the second largest importer of American products. The United States and the EU account for half of the world's economic output, and a strong European economy means a larger market for American products. As President Biden pushes for bold measures and reforms within the United States, he must encourage Europe to do the same with the transatlantic plan for economic recovery. All this will be analyzed and discussed by Mr. Jon Decker, Senior National Editor and White House Correspondent for Gray TV, and Ms. Rania Tzima, journalist and anchor for Mega TV. I welcome you both. It's a real pleasure to have you here with us today, and we are looking forward to a very interesting and fruitful to our audience discussion. Jon, the floor is yours.
Elias, and thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you for putting on this event, this timely event today. And Rania, I look forward to talking with you after my relatively short presentation. It will be about 20 minutes or so, which will give you, as well as all of the people watching, plenty of time for questions. What I want to do is take a short look back in terms of what happened in the 2020 presidential election, and then look forward in terms of what we can expect over the course of the next 2 years under President Biden. So let's go to the first slide, please, and we can take a look at what actually happened in November of 2020 during the presidential election. Let's take a look at that first slide, please. Well, in order to take a look at 2020, let's take a quick look back at 2016. President Trump, of course, won the presidential election in 2016. He won it with 306 electoral votes over Hillary Clinton, who received 232. And he did this by winning states that traditionally Republicans had not won over the course of the past 25 years, namely Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Those three states, which President Trump won by very narrow margins, were the primary reason that he was able to win the presidency in 2016. But if we take a look at the next slide, which please run that forward, please, we can take a look at how things changed dramatically just over the course of 4 years. The same electoral college total, 306 to 232, but this time it was President Trump who finished with 232. And the primary reason for that, those three states that I mentioned in the northern part of the United States, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, and also two surprises for so many, including myself. And that was the fact that President Biden won two states which traditionally have been red, traditionally have gone for the Republican presidential nominee. That is Arizona and also the state of Georgia. Both of those states were also very close, but they were not close enough to change the results in any way, despite three recounts actually happening in the state of Georgia. And so for Republicans and Democrats, they'll certainly be taking a look and focusing so much of their attention over the course of the next 4 years on those two particular states for when President Biden presumably runs for re-election. Let's take a look further down and to see what happened in November. And those three states that I mentioned, if you go to the next slide, will give you a good reason as to why President Biden won. Pennsylvania 4 years ago was won by President Trump. by over 44,000 votes, over millions of votes that were cast. 4 years later, it was President Biden who won the state by 80,000 votes. So completely flipped things around in Pennsylvania. In Wisconsin, also flipped things around as far as the Democratic nominee was concerned. President Trump winning Wisconsin by over 22,000 votes in 2016. President Biden winning the state by over 20,000 votes in 2020. And lastly, Michigan, President Trump winning Michigan by a very narrow margin, just 11,000 votes in 2016. And you see what happened in Michigan in 2020, President Biden winning that state by 154,000. And if you take all three states, different reasons why Biden was able to win all three states. In Pennsylvania, it was the suburban vote more than anything else, as well as the minority vote in Philadelphia, the largest city in Pennsylvania. The suburban vote took a chance on President Trump in 2016, but 4 years later, they tired of him to a certain extent. And so the suburbs around Pennsylvania overwhelmingly went for Joe Biden. And Philadelphia also overwhelmingly went for Joe Biden. And that really accounts for that huge margin that he built up to win the state in 2020. In Wisconsin, you see a narrow victory by Joe Biden. Again, the suburbs accounted for much of that, but also COVID was responsible for a lot of that as well. The COVID pandemic was particularly bad in the American Midwest in November of 2020. And there was a feeling in the American Midwest that the Trump administration was not doing enough to tackle the problem. And I think that accounted in large part for Joe Biden's victory. Also, the black vote in Milwaukee, the largest city in the state of Wisconsin, was also responsible for Joe Biden performing so well. And lastly, Michigan, you see that big turnaround, 154,000 vote margin of victory for Joe Biden. A reason for that, primarily the large black turnout in Detroit, the largest city by far in the state of Michigan. And that was also one of the reasons, the black vote, why President Biden won in the state of Georgia, which is not up here on this chart, but that accounts for that narrow victory that Joe Biden had in Georgia in 2020. Let's take a look at the next slide, please. And there's not many slides here. This is the second to last one. This takes a look at the popular vote, comparing 2016 to 2020. In 2016, just a reminder, Hillary Clinton actually won the popular vote in the U.S. She won it by nearly 3 million votes, but that was obviously not enough. She lost the Electoral College, and that's where elections are always decided in America. And then if you fast forward 4 years to 2020, you see a large margin of victory by Joe Biden, over 7 million vote margin of victory over President Trump as far as the popular vote totals are concerned. And if you happen to join me for the event that I had in the weeks leading up to the 2020 presidential election, I predicted that Joe Biden would win by anywhere from 5 to 7 million votes. And so that's exactly what we saw in 2020. A large reason for that, a huge margin of victory that Joe Biden managed to have in the state of California. He won that by 25%. Also in New York State, another populous state in America, that accounts for that 7 million vote margin over President Trump in the 2020 presidential election. So that takes a look back. Now let's take a look forward in terms of what we can expect under the Biden administration. Let's go to the next slide, please. And this is our last slide before we get to your questions and the questions as well coming from our great moderator who will preside over this session. First, on foreign policy, in terms of administration priorities, we know this already, but we'll see this over the course of the next 2 years. Rebuilding ties with Europe. That is something that's music to the ears of so many people watching this presentation. After all, relations between the U.S. and NATO, between the U.S. and the EU, were not very good over the course of the past 4 years. The trade tariffs policy is one example of that. And also the insistence by President Trump that the NATO member countries contribute more to the military alliance, more economically to the military alliance. That is another reason for relations not being as strong as they typically are between the U.S. and Europe. Lastly, there will be a rebuilding of ties. We've already seen this in the first week of the Biden presidency. He announced that America would rejoin the World Health Organization. So these are important signals that the Biden administration is sending to the rest of the world, but also most importantly to Europe in taking some of these actions. And we'll see more of this by the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken over the course of all 4 years of the Biden administration. On energy, as Elias mentioned in the introduction, there is a focus on this climate agenda. In fact, this is one of the big priorities of President Biden, and we've seen this so far, a rejoining of the Paris Climate Change Accord, getting the U.S. back into that pact. It's an aggressive climate agenda, and we also expect President Biden to start negotiations for new climate rules on cars and trucks and slowing or halting oil leases on federal land. So those are the types of things that we can expect over the course of the next 4 years. A lot of that can be done by President Biden alone. He doesn't need Congress to do many of those things. He can do that by executive action. On corporate taxes, and we'll get into this in our discussion, President Biden's infrastructure spending plan. How do you pay for this $2.3 trillion US dollar spending plan? According to President Biden, you do this by increasing the corporate tax rate from 21 to 28%. As you may recall, in the first year of President Trump's first year in office, he decreased or lowered the corporate tax from 35 to 21%. And so President Biden would like to increase it to 28%. You're already seeing some pushbacks from Republicans on that particular pledge that he'd like to make. And it will be difficult. It will be difficult to do that. I don't think he'll be able to get up to a 28% corporate tax rate. 25%, however, seems to be something that's more doable for some moderate Democrats, namely Joe Manchin, who's a Democrat, he's a senator from West Virginia. He seems like he's more comfortable with raising the corporate tax rate from 21 to 25% rather than from 21 to 28%. It all depends on the Senate, and that's because the Senate right now is tied 50-50. Typically with ties, you would have the Vice President Kamala Harris break those ties, but there's a procedural effort that you need to go through in the Senate. You often, on most pieces of legislation, need to get to 60 votes, and it's so difficult on so many pieces of legislation to get 10 Republican senators to break ranks. We saw that with the COVID relief bill. Not one Republican voted for the COVID relief bill, $1.9 trillion COVID relief bill, not one Republican vote in either the House or the Senate. On autos, you're going to see, and I bring this up as an important sector to take a look at because of the importance of that industry, that sector to Europe. There will be a bigger focus on electric vehicles, stricter auto emissions as well in the Biden administration. That's something that President Biden can do unilaterally by executive action. And you know, I pay attention to what's happening in the news. It seems like every major automaker in the world, whether they're based in the US or whether they're based in Europe, has announced really since the beginning of the year, certainly in the past 6 months, that either by the end of the 2020s or by the middle of the 2030s, they will have a majority of their fleet being electric vehicles, which is a remarkable thing to think about. On technology, big tech has an ally now. In the Biden administration on H-1B visas. These are the visas for individuals who have special skills that they can bring to America, that Silicon Valley in particular is very eager to have those individuals under President Trump. Those H-1B visas, the quotas for them were lowered, were decreased. I expect that they will increase under the Biden administration. And they do have an ally in the sense that the vice president comes from California, and she spent her entire political career building up those strong relationships with big tech, Microsoft, Oracle, and Facebook, Twitter. All of those companies have had a strong ally in Kamala Harris, and I think they'll continue to have a strong ally in Kamala Harris. That being said, President Biden has emphasized concerns about competitive practices and privacy. So it's not going to be the kind of free rein that we have seen under the Obama administration continuing under the Biden administration. But I do think that there will be certainly more of a welcoming than what took place under President Trump. On manufacturing, and I'll get through these quickly so we can get to our questions, we're going to see an easing of trade tariffs and trade restrictions, particularly as it relates to Europe. Those trade tariffs on imported aluminum and steel, I think, likely within the first year and a half are going to go away. It will take some negotiation, but that is what I anticipate. And no more threats of those tariffs, particularly on the auto sector, which is what we saw under President Trump during his 4 years in office. More regulation in the agriculture sector, heightened regulation in banking, particularly in domestic issues for banking, more so than international banking. And lastly, pharmaceuticals. And I'm getting right up to 20 minutes exactly. On pharmaceuticals, we're paying a lot more attention to that. Because of the coronavirus pandemic, President Biden will focus on lowering the cost and affordability of prescription drugs. That's actually something President Trump did as well. His focus was on that during his 4 years in office. That will continue under President Biden. And I think that I covered the most important industries as it relates to the AmCham Greece members. If there is something that I missed, please feel free to ask me a question during our Q&A portion. And certainly I'll talk more about relations between the United States and Greece, what we can expect over the next 4 years during our Q&A. And with that, just as I planned, I'm done with my presentation, and I can take any questions that you may have regarding this or any other issues that may come up. Thank you.
So, Jon, thank you so much. I think that Americans understood that a big change, a great change was needed for their country, and they did it. Great challenges rise ahead for Biden and his cabinet. You just described many of them. I would like to start with, allow me to start with something which is very fresh and very important for us, because we learned today, a few hours ago, that FDA and CDC suggest that vaccinations with Johnson & Johnson vaccine should stop due to possible connections with incidents of thrombosis. But Greece is expecting tomorrow 34,000 shots, and we're expecting from Johnson & Johnson something like 4 million shots. How serious is this?
Well, it's serious because it puts on hold our vaccination plans, Rania, here in the United States, and potentially your vaccination plans in Greece and perhaps throughout Europe. It's a setback, but when you keep in mind that literally millions of Johnson & Johnson vaccines have already been administered here in the U.S., and we're talking about of those millions of vaccinations, that have been administered, six cases involving potential blood clots. There's one fatality among these 6 cases, and I think that's the reason why the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention here in the U.S. and the Food and Drug Administration has put a halt on administering the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. This is an important issue. I'm glad you brought it up. It's breaking news, so to speak, and it impacts not only the United States, but it impacts the citizens of Europe as well, including
it's going to be our number one subject in the evening news.
Yes.
Because as I just said, we're expecting the first shots tomorrow. And we don't know what this means for our vaccination program. And FDA is very serious. Johnson and Johnson is a very big company, so something probably is wrong there.
Well, we know that tomorrow, Wednesday, the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the Food and Drug Administration will have a very important meeting regarding this pause and what should happen going forward. Because yesterday we saw here in the U.S. the largest number of Americans being vaccinated, over 4.5 million. And we can't expect that number that high going forward if there's a pause on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, because quite frankly, health officials here, whether you're talking about federal health officials or state health officials, we're counting on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine to be a part of the mix besides Moderna and besides Pfizer for those vaccine being administered to Americans all across the country.
Okay, I will stay in the pandemic and the vaccination program, since the new administration will have to deal with the mistrust that many Republicans show regarding vaccines. I was taking a look at the PBS News poll, according to which half of the United States population, men population, who identify themselves as Republicans, refuse to take the shot. How will Biden deal with this?
Well, Biden will need to count on actually his colleagues who are Republicans to help deal with this. First of all, President Trump, who's the leader of the Republican Party, even though he lost the presidential election, he's spoken twice on this issue. He spoke about this in a speech that he gave several weeks ago. He spoke about it again in an interview that he gave on Fox News, again several weeks ago, in which he urged his supporters, he urged his followers to get vaccinated. So that's really important that the president, the leader of the Republican Party, is saying that. The leader of Republicans in the U.S. Senate, Mitch McConnell, also has taken the opportunity to urge all Republicans, men and women, to get vaccinated when they have an opportunity to do so. So it really is a matter of the leaders of the Republican Party speaking out and urging the base, urging the supporters to go out and to tell them essentially, this is important. It's important in terms of getting the U.S. economy back to normal. It's important in terms of getting the world economy back to normal as well.
Okay, so President Biden has set a goal for 100 million vaccinations in the first 100 days of his administration. Will this goal be achieved?
It will be achieved. It will be achieved in large part because state and local officials have really ramped up their efforts to get people vaccinated. I personally have been vaccinated twice with the Pfizer vaccine. And so more and more Americans every day are getting emails or phone calls from their local or state health authorities that their turn in the line has now arrived to get vaccinated. So that goal will definitely be achieved. But keep in mind, even if it is achieved, that's less than a third of the U.S. population, in terms of being vaccinated. The U.S. population, a little over 330 million. And so there's more to do. But I think a more reasonable goal is to have the vast majority of the U.S. population, well over 70% of the U.S. population, vaccinated by the end of this summer.
Okay, so the Congress approval of the fiscal stimulus bill of $1.9 trillion for the U.S. economy recovery was regarded as President Biden's political victory. It's an enormous recovery plan, approximating, if I'm right, 9% of U.S. GDP. Correct me if I'm wrong. How will this public spending be utilized, and what sources will fund the fiscal stimulus?
Rania, it's a great question, and it is important. It was important. It was important that this type of COVID relief bill be passed because families across America certainly could use the help, who have been put out of work because of the coronavirus pandemic. And small businesses certainly as well could use the help that is provided in this COVID relief bill. This was, as you point out, Rania, $1.9 trillion US. This comes on the heels of another COVID relief bill being signed by President Trump at the end of December for 900 billion US dollars. So certainly the US economy has been helped by the actions taken by lawmakers, the actions of Congress and the president. And in fact, the US Federal Reserve Board chief said over the weekend that were it not for these efforts by Congress, he really fears what would have happened to not only the US economy, but to the world economy as well. And so how is it being funded? It's being funded, quite frankly, by debt. There's no, taxes that are propping up this new COVID relief bill. It's essentially the Federal Reserve printing more money. That's how it's being funded. And that the fact that it was increased debt, that was one of the reasons why not one Republican voted for it. There are lots of deficit hawks, so to speak, in the US Congress. And for them, the amount of this COVID relief bill, more than double the last one in terms of its scope, was problematic for them.
Okay. Do you think that such a recovery plan for the United States can signify a rebounding of the states in the global economy in a period that China contests the role of the leading economy power in the world?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons and fears that President Biden was really pushing forward with this legislative effort. His first legislative victory is China, is the economic threat that China poses to the U.S., to Europe, to the rest of the world. And in order to compete, in order to get the U.S. economy back to the place where it ought to be, it was necessary to have Congress pass this COVID relief bill. And so what we see is the U.S. unemployment rate coming down month after month. It's now down to 6%. And so it needs to come down, obviously, more than what it was. But every month we see some very positive numbers in terms of the number of jobs that have been created for the U.S. economy.
Okay, so the U.S. Economy recovery prospects have improved significantly, and for many commentators, United States will be able to cover the recession gap within the current year. However, the big question is whether this recovery impact will trickle down to middle and lower incomes, namely these segments of the U.S. population that became the bone of contention between the Democrats and the Republicans in the latest presidential elections. Do you see it also as a strategy of mitigating social inequalities and fuel Trump's populism apart from a macroeconomic plan?
Well, so much in terms of answering your question, Rania, depends on where we are in terms of the coronavirus pandemic. Because if America gets back to the place it was, pre-pandemic, the place where it was in 2019, then the service economy in particular is going to bounce back. Bars and restaurants, which were shut down, not only here in the United States, but this so well in Greece, has just devastated so many parts of the U.S. economy and so many families across the U.S. And so if we're on top of the situation as it relates to the coronavirus pandemic and the U.S. economy reopens, the service economy reopens, then I think you're going to see a really remarkable increase in America's GDP, which benefits the world as well. When America is zooming along in terms of our economy, it has a trickle-down effect on South America. It has a trickle-down effect on Asia and certainly on Europe as well.
Okay, let's move far from the pandemic and the U.S. economy and focus on U.S. foreign policy. When we heard President Biden calling Vladimir Putin a killer and stating that Russia will pay the price for its interference in the U.S. elections, it was perceived as a return of the Cold War climate and rhetoric. What does President Biden's statement about Russia paying the price mean, in your opinion? And do you share the view that tension in U.S. and Russia relations comes back in from the cold?
Well, that is a question we're all asking. First of all, the rhetoric used by President Biden I don't know. I can't get inside his head. I don't know if he wants to take back that language, calling President Putin a killer. That's pretty harsh rhetoric. And we know it got to President Putin because it got an immediate reaction from him.
Yeah, he was annoyed.
He was annoyed, exactly. So look, right now as things stand, I don't see U.S. relations with Russia coming back to a place that I think the rest of the world can be comfortable with. I think that's a good description that you used, Rania, sort of back to the Cold War. And I think that we're to a certain extent in a worse place than we were during the Trump years, in the sense that President Trump, as you know, during his all 4 years as president, was very reluctant to ever criticize President Putin.
It's like America is back to what we knew.
Yeah, that's right. That's right, because it was like that certainly during the Obama years. There was a little bit of a thaw during the George W. Bush years, and I covered the presidency, the White House during the Bush years as well. But we're not in a good place right now. That's for sure. As to what he meant, to answer your question, Rania, by that veiled threat against Russia, I don't know what he means. There already are sanctions that have been imposed upon Russia. I don't know what more you can do against Russia. And Russia, of course, is a world power. It has its own veto that it can wield and use at the UN Security Council. So to a certain extent, it's always a little good, or a little better, I should say, to have Russia in a place where there is détente, sort of a meeting of the minds, so that you can get some things done at the United Nations Security Council, and you don't face that veto threat that Russia has and China has as well.
Okay, let's go to the other crucial front in foreign policy, lies in the Western Pacific area and concerns the United States' relations with China. During the last days, we have witnessed an unusual tension between the two countries, with the U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken stating that he's concerned by China's increasingly aggressive actions towards Taiwan and the Philippines, and for trying to change the existing status quo by force, while the U.S. administration has fiercely criticized the Chinese treatment against the Muslim minority of Uyghurs. On the other hand, Beijing fires back by stating that it is the presence of the U.S. Navy in the area and the Taiwanese government that is trying to change the status quo. How do you think the U.S.-China relations will develop under the Biden administration?
Well, it's an excellent question, Rania. And I've always maintained, I maintained this during the time that Joe Biden was running for president, and I still maintain it today, that we will certainly in the first year of the Biden administration will not see any difference in terms of the approach that the Biden administration has towards China than what President Trump had towards China. President Biden views China as a strategic adversary. It views China as an economic adversary. We saw that sort of come to a head just a few weeks ago when U.S. officials met with Chinese officials in Alaska. And
it was very tense, unusually tense. In front of the cameras, in front of journalists.
I agree with you 100%. Unusually tense. And look, there are many reasons for that. The harsh rhetoric that we heard from President Trump targeting China during the course of his presidency is one reason, maybe, for that. You even heard over the weekend the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, use some of the same language that some Trump officials used as it relates to China's blame for the coronavirus pandemic. He said over the weekend on a Sunday morning show, Meet the Press, Rania, that China should have done more in the beginning stages of the coronavirus pandemic to essentially warn the rest of the world about how bad this pandemic could get. And so that language sounded a lot to me like what we heard, for instance, from the former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. So I don't see relations having a thaw anytime soon between the U.S. and China. They will remain tense for the time being. And, as far as reducing those trade tariffs that exist on Chinese goods, I don't see that happening anytime soon either.
Okay, so let us move on to the Middle East now, and by that we are coming closer to our neighborhood. Do you believe that the new U.S. administration will be more active in Syria, a region where regional powers like Russia, Iran, Turkey have taken advantage of the withdrawal of the U.S. interests under the Trump administration? And I would like also a comment particularly on Iran's relations, since we have witnessed a substantial change between Obama and Trump's stance towards the country.
Well, that's exactly right. So on Iran, as you know, the U.S. has met indirectly with Iranian officials. There's always been an intermediary that has been present during talks that have taken place over the course of the past week in Vienna, Austria. The U.S. would like to, under favorable circumstances, see the U.S. rejoin and have be a part of the Iran nuclear deal. And so that's a major difference from what we saw during the Trump administration. Relations between the U.S. and Iran were at the lowest point that we've seen perhaps since the American hostage crisis in the late 70s. So I do foresee an improvement of relations between the U.S. and Iran. And that's not a surprise. President Biden said as much when he was a candidate for president. You also asked me, Rania, about Syria. And
Yes.
in Syria, this is a situation that, as you know, President Trump really wanted to essentially remove all U.S. involvement, remove U.S. forces, remove U.S. special forces. And essentially, that is what he was able to accomplish during his 4 years in office. But having said that, I think that there will be more attention that will be focused on Syria. And I think that's necessary because of the problems that it poses to its neighbors in the region. So this will also occupy so much of the time of the U.S. Secretary of State. His probably biggest foreign policy challenge, Rania, is, like it was under President Trump, North Korea. That's the biggest foreign policy challenge I think the world faces, North Korea, because of the leadership that exists there, the unpredictability of Kim Jong-un. But Syria is also a major challenge for the U.S. and the rest of the world.
Okay, so a few weeks ago, we celebrated the 200 years from the Greek Revolution against the Ottoman Empire. I was personally touched by President Biden's message on the bicentennial of 1821, especially when he underlined the common values and historic ties that our people share. So do you think that Greece should and could anticipate more by Biden administration comparing to Trump?
Well, here's something that I think everybody on this AmCham event already knows, and that is that Greece has gained strategic importance for the United States in the context of major power competition. Even back in 2018, during the Trump administration, the then Secretary of State noted that the U.S. was cultivating Greece as an anchor of stability. Those are his words. As part of a long-term strategy to bolster the U.S. presence in the region and also counter the influence of China and Russia. That will certainly continue under President Biden. I think we're seeing this already. The U.S. has great support for Greece. In fact, it is actively appreciated that Greece has promoted regional partnerships of American allies that are willing to work together to foster cooperation in the Eastern Mediterranean. Among these, the Israel-Cyprus-Greece partnerships in particular, that's been endorsed by the U.S. Congress. So I think, Rania, that is something that is of extreme importance to the Biden administration and will continue over the course of the next 4 years.
Okay, a few days ago, the State Department imposed sanctions against the Turkish Defense Agency and 4 of its officials as a countermeasure for the Turkish insistence on acquiring S-400, a Russian anti-aircraft missile system. Would it be right to anticipate a more strict stance by the administration towards Erdogan's Turkey?
Yes, certainly when you compare it, Rania, to what existed during the Trump years. For
Mhm.
whatever reason, President Trump had a strong relationship with Erdogan in Turkey, and that will not continue with President Biden. You know, to a certain extent, I think Erdogan's political future is, I wouldn't say in doubt, but it's not as strong as it was a few years ago. And I think that this is another reason why the U.S. Greece relationship is so important because of some of the problems that we're seeing right now. And Turkey's reaching out to traditional adversaries of the U.S. in some respects, whether you're talking about China or
Yes.
Russia. And so I do believe that you're going to see a tougher approach taken towards President Erdogan, towards Turkey by the Biden administration.
Mhm. Okay, let's change the field. On the top of the new administration agenda, we can find climate change and the environmental protection as priorities, as President Biden wants to denounce Trump's legacy on the specific issue. One of the new administration's first executive orders was rejoining the United States to the Paris Climate Agreement. Now, President Biden, under his 1.9 trillion recovery plan, the American Jobs Plan, aspires to put forward a clean energy and environmentally friendly infrastructure project. Can you tell us the main energy and environmental related provisions on this plan?
Well, this is a very important aspect of the Biden administration economic strategy. They believe that this is the future. It's the
Mhm.
future in terms of jobs, not only in America, but around the world. And they see greater emphasis being placed upon clean energy rather than fossil fuels. The auto companies here in America recognize that. That's the reason why they are now pivoting towards electric vehicles. I see this happening among the large European automakers as well. And so what we see is a significant amount of resources devoted towards pushing the U.S. in that direction. There, on the Republican side, it's important to keep in mind, sort of what the other side has to say. On the Republican side, there's concern of a precipitous movement towards clean energy, meaning not a gradual movement to clean energy, because if you don't have the gradual move to clean energy, they say and they fear that a significant number of U.S. jobs that are in the fossil fuels industry could be negatively impacted. And so that will be the continued pushback coming from Republicans. But it's important to keep in mind, Rania, that for the next 2 years, and I'll explain why, so much of what President Biden wants to do in this area will likely get done. I say the next 2 years because that's the midterm elections. And so the makeup of Congress will be the makeup of Congress for the next 2 years leading up to 2022. Democrats will continue to control the House and continue to control the Senate, even though it's a 50-50 Senate. It's the Vice President Kamala Harris who can break those ties. And so whether you're talking about making efforts in terms of clean energy proposals through regulations, which can be done unilaterally without any movement from Congress, you're going to see that continue over the course of the next, not just 2 years, but 4 years. And then there'll be some moves as it relates to legislation as well. And that will not be as easy because there are some members of the U.S. Senate in particular that come from states in which jobs really depend on fossil fuels, the coal industry in particular, West Virginia. The Democratic senator from West Virginia, Joe Manchin, he's not going to vote for anything that would destroy jobs or negatively impact jobs in his state. So that's something that we'll certainly have to keep in mind.
Okay, John, let me pass you over a question which a friend has sent us here. They are asking, there are many references in comparing the Biden's stimulus program with the one which came back in the 30s. Do you think there are similarities, and to what extent it can reform the country and its global status as it did in the past?
Well, There are similarities in terms of if you just look at the raw numbers of jobs that were lost, the raw numbers in terms of the unemployment rate that the U.S. plummeted to because of the coronavirus pandemic. But the big difference between what happened during the Great Depression and what happened over the course of the past year, not only in the U.S., but in the rest of the world, is that the fundamentals for a strong U.S. economy were there. The fundamentals are still there for a strong U.S. economy. So the point that must be made is that once we get through this health crisis, once we get through this economic downturn that we had as a result of the coronavirus pandemic, the U.S. economy is poised to have a very strong rebound in the U.S. economy. Some have called it a V-shaped recovery, just like that. I do see already evidence of that happening with the strong jobs numbers that have come out, as well as the fact that the unemployment rate has indeed come down from 9-10% all the way down to 6% nationally, and it's come down even further in many states across the U.S. So in that respect, it's very different than what happened in the 1930s. Having said that, this is a significant amount of money that's being used to sort of give a jump start, Rania, to the U.S. economy. And don't just take it from me, the Fed chairman has also said this was extremely important and has been extremely important in terms of propping up the U.S. economy.
Okay, so let me get back to my questions. U.S. and EU transatlantic relations had deteriorated under the previous U.S. administration. Do you see the Biden administration pledged to a return to a multilateralism and diplomacy as an opportunity for these relations? Which do you think are the key fields of a renewed partnership between the United States and the European Union?
Oh, absolutely. I think that relations are already improving between the U.S. and the EU, the United States and Europe. We see improvements in terms of the language that's coming out from diplomats in Europe, and also American diplomats as well. So to coin that term that you just used, Rania, multilateralism, that is something that we'll see being a hallmark of the Biden administration on so many different things, whether you're talking about diplomacy or whether you're talking about trade. Because one thing that we saw an approach taken by the Trump administration was there was more of an interest in bilateral trade agreements, not multilateral trade agreements that we saw being a hallmark of the Obama administration. You may recall TTIP, which was an effort in terms of multilateral trade that was done away with, essentially scrapped by the Trump administration. I think you'll see a return to efforts to increase trade on a multilateral basis between the U.S. and Europe, and also on a multilateral basis between the U.S. and Asia. After all, I think that one thing that can be accomplished, I don't think anybody would disagree, is by unifying an approach between the U.S. and the EU towards China. We have the largest economies in the world, and you can apply so much pressure on China if there's simply cooperation in that effort. And for whatever reason, that never happened during the Trump years, and there's an opportunity for that during the Biden years.
Okay, let me change once again my field. We observe that human rights in many places around the world are under attack, and authoritarian governments arise. One could mention the situation in Myanmar, in Turkey, in Iran, in China, and in several countries in the Middle East, which are traditional allies of the United States under the Biden administration. Which clearly shares more liberal values than its predecessor. Do you believe that issues of human rights and democratic values would dictate foreign policy and the financial aid agenda?
Well, in some respects, yes. I think you really have to look, Rania, to specific places in the world. So, for instance, Hong Kong. That's an instance where I do believe that human rights will dictate the relationship that the U.S. has with Hong Kong and by extension by China. But this administration, as you rightly point out, Rania, will be focused and already is more focused on human rights issues than President Trump's administration, which sometimes look the other way as it relates to human rights abuses happening around the world. I don't think that you're likely to see that occur with the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. He has spoken out on issues concerning human rights. You mentioned the Uyghurs in China. You mentioned Myanmar as well. These are issues in which the administration already in the past few weeks has put out very strong statements, both on paper and also from the White House press briefing room about these trouble spots around the world.
Okay, a field of cooperation between the United States and the European Union seems to be on the digital economy. United States is by far the most advanced country in terms of what has been called the fourth industrial revolution. At the same time, Europe has made significant steps forward. The European regulation on data extraction and privacy protection has created quite often disputes between American technology companies and the European Commission when the former want to operate in Europe. Do you think that the two regions can reach a middle way by combining a technological enhancement in our economies with protection at the same time of individual privacy?
Well, this is one of those issues, Rania, that we didn't see any progress in during the course of the past 4 years. And so I think that what I've seen, at least from the technology companies themselves, is a willingness to find some sort of middle ground. After all, more and more, a larger percentage of their income on an annual basis is coming from Europe. And as a result, if you are doing a significant amount of business in Europe, you have to abide by European rules. And sometimes those rules are things that have troubled them. But having said that, I do think that there will be an effort to find some sort of compromises, not only by private sector in terms of their dealings with European Union officials in these areas, but also by the Biden administration trying to become some sort of intermediary to find solutions to deal with these issues.
Okay, I have another question from a friend of ours. I think you have answered some of these parts, but I will pose it. How high are the democratic values, gender diversity, environment and privacy, and intellectual rights in the US administration agenda, and how all this could contribute to the formation with certain other countries of a strong set of standards that could dictate global trade and economy?
Well, there will be certain issues that you just touched upon that will be sort of a part of trade negotiations that maybe would not have been a part of trade negotiations and were not a part of trade negotiations that existed under President Trump. So these issues that you mentioned, issues of equity are so important. Issues of fairness are so important. Labor issues, which sometimes are set aside under Republican administrations, will take on greater importance in a Biden administration, and you can certainly bet that those issues will be a part of any type of trade efforts undertaken by this administration in Europe or in Asia or in any other part of the world.
Okay, so Jon, thank you so much for being so patient and answering to all my questions and the questions posed by our friends. So let me pass over to Mr. Spirtounas for the closing remarks. Mr. Spirtounas.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this conversation. Excellent questions. Actually, most of them I hadn't, written here on my page. Thank you, Rania, by the way, for your excellent moderation and your questions that ignited a very interesting, I think, conversation to all of us. Thank you, Jon, again, once more, for presenting us a very clear picture of what is happening now in the U.S. on the political scene, on the foreign diplomacy, and on the economic and health front, and what we should expect in the near future. Last, I want to thank all you who connected with us today and watched this discussion from not only from Greece, but from many other countries. And we look forward to see you in one of our next events. Have a very good evening or very good morning, depending where you are. Bye-bye.